Hello, Revere, and welcome to our Revere Veterans and Community Show. Today we have two great guests. We usually have a lot of great guests, but today we have two special great guests. One is Mr. Jeff Pearlman. Jeff, you are a professor of history at Salem State College.
I am.
Thank you for taking the time off.
My pleasure. Thank you.
To come down. And Mr. Miles Kennedy, who's on your left. Welcome to the show, Miles. He's from the mayor's office from the city of Revere, Miles.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're going to be talking a little about the Civil War today, and these two gentlemen know much, much, much more than I do, so we'll start off with the professor first, so take it away.
Okay. What's going on right now in South Carolina, of course, is big news. And when something like this happens, of course, the Civil War comes up all the time. And my contention is basically that the major cause of the American Civil War was over what we call states' rights. That is, the right of a state to nullify an act of Congress. It goes back to the very beginning of our history. And you can put slavery, you can put the tariff, you can put who's going to pay for internal improvements, you can put any cause that people say the Civil War began on under the term states' rights. My point being, the argument with the Confederate flag right now is indeed states' rights all over again. It is my contention that the Civil War never ended on April 9th, 1865. No, it still goes on today. And as we speak, the South Carolina House of Representatives are debating whether or not to take the Confederate flag down from the top of the mast that's hanging over the State House in Columbia. Actually, the Confederate flag that's flying now is really not the Confederate flag, it's the battle flag of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The Confederate flag was something completely different. My opinion is that indeed the Confederate flag should come down. Why, you might say? Isn't it historically important in our study? What about the culture of the South, the traditions of the South? Absolutely. However, over the last, maybe 50 years, bigots, segregationists, racists have used the stars and bars as a symbol of prejudice, a symbol of hatred. Indeed, in the latest killing of 9 innocent people in the church in Charleston, the perpetrator had a picture of the Confederate flag on him. And obviously he was associated with white supremacist groups. Some people want to go even further, Morris. Some people want to take down Robert E. Lee's home in Arlington. Some people want to destroy some of the statues in the Capitol. They want to change the name of, let's say, Fort Bragg to another name because General Bragg was instrumental as a Confederate general. I'm against all that. That ruins our history. As a historian, it bothers me to no end to see that people want to go, in my opinion, over the top. But in terms of the Confederate flag, as I said before, because it's a symbol, and it has been a symbol especially during the Civil Rights Movement, for those who were against integration. During the busing movement in the 70s here in Boston, there were Confederate flags flying in South Boston. It is my opinion that the flag belongs not as a public symbol in Columbia, but in a museum where other relics of the Civil War belong. The Civil War has been over for 150 years. It's time we move on.
Right, Jeff. I'd like to say one thing. The Confederate flag, I think, should never have been hung at any public place. Public, I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
If people want to hang it in their own yard or in their own home, they're free to do that. Because I think the only flag that should be at the State House in all 50 states is Old Glory. Old Glory alone.
Absolutely.
Now, Miles, you're also a history buff.
And I agree with what Mr. Pearlman said completely. I think that, I grew up reading Killer Angels as a child. That was one of the first books I learned how to read. And I grew up learning about the Confederate generals, and I understood that there was slavery, but I can see where the flag needs to come down. My parents were very active in the Civil Rights Movement, but when you start getting into changing history, people at West Point still learn about Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign. There's so much history that happened with the people in the Civil War that I think you really need to, there needs to be a line kind of in the sand where we understand that this is a symbol today that a lot of people in the country have issues with, but the history itself is very interesting, and we shouldn't push that all away. When you start to get into, somebody, I was reading an article somewhere, said that Washington D.C. was named after, one of our greatest presidents who was a slave owner. He helped. Should we rename Washington, D.C.? And you can go into, situation after situation where we can't be revisionist and just trying to change history. That's where we get into a bad argument.
Question for both of you. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't it true that a lot of African Americans of African descent also fought for the South? Were in the Army of the South?
Only in the final days when they were desperate. But no, to arm slaves or former slaves, no, not until the very end.
Yeah, that would have been like hypocrisy,
Yeah.
I think, to the Southerners.
Okay.
And they might have been afraid that they might have turned on their owners as well.
Yeah.
Right. Now,
Of course, there were African Americans who fought in the North.
Hundreds
Oh,
of
yeah.
thousands,
Yes.
yeah. The Massachusetts 54th was there's
You know,
a
a lot
statue
of-
right outside the State
Right.
House.
Exactly.
If you walk up the State House, I don't know what street it is, if you take a left, there's a big statue right
Yeah.
there. It's awesome.
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people think, like I myself used to think, that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves, but that's not really true. It was fought for states' rights.
Right. Well, of course it was to free the slaves as well. However, as I said before, all of those issues, such as the argument over abolition versus slavery, the argument over a high protective tariff that the North wanted because we imported goods as opposed to the South who exported goods, in terms of the issue of who's going to pay for internal improvements, South said, no, why should we pay for internal improvements when we don't have railroads, when we don't have canals? Let the states that have and enjoy those accoutrements, let them pay for them. In other words, all of those, what I'm trying to say, Morris, falls under the umbrella term states' rights. Now, when did states' rights come about? As I said before, states' rights has been around since the beginning of our history. When John Adams was president, he passed various issues that were controversial. One of them was something called the Alien and Sedition Acts, in which he tried to stop newspapers and the editors of those newspapers from talking badly about his political party and him personally. He also passed laws that would deport aliens or immigrants. And of course it was against freedom of speech. And his own vice president at that time was Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
And Jefferson, of course, belonged to a different political party because in those days
Was
the
that
12th
the Whig-
Amendment.
the Whig Party?
No, that was the Anti-Federalist Party,
okay.
The Democratic Republican Party. And to make a long story short, Jefferson and Madison wrote anonymous letters called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions opposing the Alien and Sedition Act, saying it is absolutely right for a state, if they do not agree with a particular act of Congress, to nullify it, to disobey it. And of course, Jefferson changed his mind about that when he became president. But right through our history, we see a pattern. In 1828, there was an argument between Andrew Jackson, who wanted a high protective tariff, and his vice president, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, who wanted no tariff. It ended up with John C. Calhoun, believe it or not, becoming the first vice president to resign in office. He was so angry at Jackson by the fact that he did not lower the protective tariff. And the famous Webster-Hayne debates. If you go into Faneuil Hall today, the Great Hall, if you walk up the second floor, the large painting that you see in front of you is the famous painting of Daniel Webster arguing against Robert Hayne of South Carolina over states' rights. Daniel Webster's famous quote, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable," where he believed that the federal government should be supreme. And obviously Robert Hayne, John C. Calhoun, and others from the South believed in states' rights, that a state had every right to disobey and nullify a law if it hurt that particular state. And as I said, it's going on today with the Confederate flag as well.
I got a question that has nothing really to do with the Civil War, but I mean it could. San Francisco is open city, I guess, for immigrants or illegals and theirs that come in.
Right.
But the federal government has jurisdiction, but they don't do anything about it because of San Francisco. Why is that? I thought the federal government had the power to tell the states what to do.
They do. And San Francisco is obviously going against
And the reason I mentioned that because there was just a murder
Yes,
recently
that's
by
right.
an illegal immigrant.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And he went, and 5 times he was in San Francisco, and 5 times they refused to extradite him.
Right.
Well, there's certain things that, like, the federal government, the local government, and the state government can do. So I think sometimes there's a little gray area. So I think that's what's happening there, that they're not actually doing what they're supposed to do. But you see it, I mean, you see it going on across the country with all sorts of states' rights. I was reading an article yesterday that there's a county in Texas that's trying to secede. I mean, there's all sorts of states' rights issues still going on today. I mean, and what frustrates me so much about, I have friends that are liberal, and I would consider myself a liberal as also. But some people don't understand that Robert E. Lee, after the Civil War, correct me, Professor, if I'm wrong, but he was one of the main people that was trying to unify the country after the war. So if we need to understand that history. That
Wasn't Robert E. Lee, excuse me, one of the generals that brought Arizona into the Union?
That brought out?
That fought to keep the certain states in the South?
But I know that during the Civil War, at least when it was ending, that a lot of his soldiers were saying, let's start a guerrilla war, let's go into the hills in West Virginia. And he told everyone to put down their arms, because he, even more than General Johnson and some of these other guys, was really the figurehead of the Confederacy, even though I would argue more than Jefferson Davis. And when he spoke, people really listened. So without him, that war, I think personally, I always like to argue opinions, could have gone on. I think if Robert E. Lee had said to his troops, keep fighting, I think it would have gone on.
Miles?
I think he was.
Jefferson Davis was captured eventually, and then he was pardoned.
Yeah.
Oh, he was?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 It's absolutely amazing that no generals, no people in the Confederate government were ever severely punished for
war crimes.
Yeah, but what about General Sherman when he made his famous march through Atlanta, I believe it was?
Yeah, he was. I just finished a book about him. He was one of the first generals that started the whole total war concept. So that really, and I actually, after college, I spent a year in Mississippi doing Habitat for Humanity, and I made the mistake of having a conversation with a Southerner about the Civil War.
Oh, boy.
And I said that I liked Sherman, and they got pretty upset with me. So I learned pretty quickly. But but that's the other thing about the Civil War that I like, at least too, is that there's so many characters in American history. I don't see the collection of. You had Sherman, you had Jackson, you had all sorts of interesting men that were fighting on both sides.
What I say to my students, Morris, that if it weren't for General Sherman and his successful march from Atlanta to Savannah and presenting Lincoln with Savannah in the fall of 1864, Abraham Lincoln may not have won re-election that year.
Very good point.
The war was not going very well, even after Gettysburg. But with Sherman's march from Atlantic to the sea, it just turned the tide. It made George McClellan, who was the choice for the Democratic Party in 1864, almost like a laughingstock. And Lincoln won with no problem.
Very good point.
The Southern generals, of course, Robert E. Lee being the most famous, whatever happened to him after the war was over?
Didn't he go to university?
He became the president of the university, which is now Washington and Lee University.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes. So he didn't live that much longer though after the war.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was old when
Grant lived into the 1880s. Okay, and died of lung cancer because he supposedly smoked about 10 or 15 cigars and drank quite heavily.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a funny story about Grant and his habit of drinking whiskey. He was the only successful general that Lincoln had after firing one after the other in the first few years. So somebody came up to Lincoln one day and said, Mr. President, do you know that General Grant is an alcoholic? And Lincoln supposedly said, well, if that's true, send a case of liquor to each one of my generals.
But that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's those kind of American stories make the whole history of it fascinating. Like, when I was a little kid, I was obsessed with Stonewall Jackson and reading about him. I guess during certain battles, he would suck, correct me if I'm wrong, he would suck on a lemon.
That's true.
And just stand there, sucking on a lemon.
Yeah.
I don't know, completely crazy. I mean, just the gentlemen that were fighting in Sherman, too, he had fiery red hair. He was probably my height. I mean, it's hard to see. I mean, when I was learning about it, because all the pictures are in black and white, so you can't really visualize it. So you have to read the documents. You have to read what they're actually saying. So if you actually look at some of the first-hand texts and read what some of these guys, like what Sherman's executive orders were, it's really, you start to understand their characters themselves.
Jeff, I got to ask you, why do they call it the Civil War? I mean,
that's a good question. It should be the uncivil war, right? Yeah, Civil War is almost an oxymoron, you know. Actually, the South to this day will not call it the Civil War. They will call it the war between the states or the war of northern aggression.
Or the Second
if you
War of
will.
Independence.
Even today?
too.
Yeah, even today. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
As Miles said, you don't go on Peach Street in Atlanta, Georgia, and start talking about General Sherman in positive terms because you may not come back alive.
I was 20 years old, so I was still a little gung-ho. So.
Like I said, the Civil War has not ended, and there are so many examples throughout our history in which people in the South still feel that they got the shaft.
And you also have all the history of Texas, too, which feeds into that Confederacy. Like, they had their own war, they had their own secession. So people from Texas and that very deep South, I mean, even more than Virginia, I think, personally, because Texas had their own war with Mexico, the Alamo, all of these their own cultural history. Yeah. That's what makes America great, is that you have all these different histories all across the country. Yeah. It's really fun to learn about.
Pretty good.
You know, we seem to be parochial here in New England. We talk about the Pilgrims and we talk about, the Revolutionary War. And we forget, as Miles said, that there's people in Texas. You can't graduate from high school in Texas unless you pass a course on Texas history. Mm-hmm. I kind of wish we had that here, where students have to take a course in Massachusetts history.
Well, we had the #1 superintendent in the country right here, Mr.
Oh, yes.
Bacon, and the kids that come out of, I had a lady here, young lady the other day, brilliant student, brilliant. And so,
But like I grew up as a small kid, and when I was interested in history, my parents would take me to Lexington and Concord. Mm-hmm. But if you're in Texas, I mean, it's completely different. Mississippi, Arizona, San Francisco. I mean, the way we learn is so based on where we live, like you said. I mean, it's fascinating.
When I lived in New York and we studied history in New York, and I used to hear about Paul Revere, the North End, the church, the Faneuil Hall, like you mentioned, it meant nothing to me until I came up here, and then I looked at the places that I studied as a kid, and then when I went in there, I sort of kind of got a little shiver because I was living history right in Massachusetts.
Yeah. It's so sad that that people who have lived in Boston their entire lives have never seen the USS Constitution or have climbed up the Bunker Hill Monument.
I went to see Old Ironsides.
Yep.
I loved it. I went to see Bunker Hill, the monument of Bunker Hill in Charlestown.
I take my I take my class there every summer.
Do you?
On a field trip. Yep.
Oh, it's good.
Yep.
I recently, this past November, I went to the first Battle of Bull Run, and I had read. So whenever I go to a battlefield before, I'm a nerd. I'm not a closet nerd. I'll admit I'm a nerd. I read a book about the battle before, and just going there and seeing these places, because I think the U.S. government's done a fantastic job with some battlefields of maintaining it, and it becomes. When you go to these places and you are there, like you said, you get shivers. I mean, it's just imagining what was happening here.
Here's a hypothetical question, but I don't know, I'm not familiar. Did any of the American Indian tribes side with either the North or the South against one or the other? None at all?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Remember, Native Americans were not they were considered like African Americans as property. They weren't considered people.
The Native Americans?
Native Americans were even below the African Americans.
I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
So I've always tried to figure out, I know that during the Civil War, a lot of northern troops came out of Boston, and there were some camps and stuff. Is there anything else besides the 54th Monument for Civil War history in Boston? I've never been able to find anything. I know the 54th, I know there were some markers in Boston Harbor, or anything closer. I hate having to drive all the way down south.
No, although at Fort Warren, in Boston Harbor.
Okay, yeah.
Do you know that at one time the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, was held prisoner there?
Ooh, see, that's a good.
Okay,
note.
and if you tour Fort Warren, they'll bring that out as you tour Fort Warren.
I think I went there when I was little, but
okay.
I'm gonna go again then.
There's also a statue in the public gardens on the Arlington Street side of a former senator from Massachusetts by the name of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was an outspoken abolitionist, and he got himself in trouble in 1856 by actually speaking harshly against a former senator from South Carolina. To make a long story short, this South Carolinian senator's nephew, who was a congressman, heard about this, and he began to stalk Charles Sumner. And believe it or not, one morning, he snuck up behind Charles Sumner, who was sitting writing letters on the Senate floor, and began to beat Sumner over the head with a cane until Sumner became unconscious. He was out of commission for about 3 years and then eventually came back into the Senate and was very instrumental in convincing William Seward, who was the Secretary of State, to buy Alaska from Russia in 1867. So there's a statue of Charles Sumner.
Isn't there a statue, the Hooker entrance of the State House? Isn't that a general too?
Joseph Hooker.
But he wasn't from Massachusetts.
Joseph Hooker was from Massachusetts. He was the Battle of, I want to say, Chancellorsville. Yeah. And he was unsuccessful.
Yeah.
And we still have a statue of him on horseback right in front of the State House. That's
Here's
correct.
a good question for both of you. There was about 600,000, I believe, killed during the Civil War. How does that break down? How many on the North and how many on the South?
Almost even, yeah.
You know, Jeff, but the way I look at it, more people were killed during the Civil War than than the Second World War, than the Revolutionary War.
More people were killed in the Civil War than all the wars up to Vietnam.
Yeah.
All together. Yeah.
Isn't that
I know.
ironic?
First time I heard that, I was like you, absolutely amazed.
I was flabbergasted.
But
really,
remember, it's American. It's brother against brother. It's American against America.
In the warfare, like the tactics, they were using tactics from like 40 or 50 years before, and the weapons they were using had advanced. It would be like, it's hard to explain, but it's almost like I don't know what other way to explain it. But they were using weapons that were so far advanced, and they were standing 50 to 100 yards away from each other, just blasting into each other. And it was only until the end of the war, when they started digging trenches, that they started to understand. Because like some of the battles in 1864, 20,000 men were dying in 2 or 3 days.
At the Battle of the Wilderness, Petersburg and Spotsylvania, Grant just sent one group after another into battle. I mean, he was a butcher, but he was successful.
And I think Cold Harbor, I don't know.
Cold Harbor was another one, right?
I mean, they were just walking into fire.
That whole wilderness campaign in 1864 was just Grant's final push toward Richmond.
It's funny you mentioned that because a year ago, we went on an honor flight. We went to Washington, D.C., to Arlington National Cemetery.
Yep.
And the tour guide explained to us, so he didn't take us up there, but he says, if you look up on the hill, which was the house that was up there, that was Robert E. Lee's home
Yes.
there.
They
And
took
they
it
want
over
to take
the
it
cemetery.
away now?
I know.
I don't think it will ever happen. I think there's enough people that respect history that will speak up.
They even want to take away this from us.
Can I go back to something that Miles said?
Yes.
Okay. He mentioned that he was at the site of the first Battle of Bull Run.
And I went to the second one, too. It's
Okay.
right down the street.
What's fascinating about the first Battle of Bull Run, and Miles I know knows this, is that this happened in July of 1861, just a couple of months after war began. And we were so confident, the North was so confident, the Union was so confident that we would win, the war would be over by Christmas, people were saying, that the night before the battle and during the early morning, ladies and gentlemen and senators from Washington, D.C. would get in their best clothes and they get in their carriages and they pack their picnic lunches and they go down to the Manassas to see the first Battle of Bull Run because they thought it would be a show. Well, what happened was that General McDowell, who was the commander of the Union forces, got his tail whipped. And what happened was, instead of a victory, Union forces retreated, and everybody left their picnic baskets and their hats, and they called it the Great Skedaddle because everybody just took off to save their lives. And they say that if McDowell and if Stonewall Jackson and others had followed that battle up and gone into Washington, D.C., the war would have been over.
Exactly.
Right.
For the South.
For the South. South would have won.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, you had thousands of Union troops and just civilians running into Washington.
Okay.
If 2,000 Confederates had just followed them in, I mean, the war could have been over really quick.
The two of you should sit down and write a book together about the...
I'm still learning a lot. I have a lot more to
about
learn.
the untold history of the Civil War, because there's a lot of stuff that you said, Jeff, and you too, Miles.
There's so much.
That I never even heard of.
I read another book. Sorry to keep going on, but there was
go
a
ahead.
county in, I don't know if it was Mississippi or Alabama, that actually, I think they seceded from the Confederacy during the war. And they just seceded, and they led a guerrilla war against Confederate troops. So you just had all these different stories, like the story you just told. I mean, I forget the name of the book.
Excuse me, gentlemen, we got about 3 minutes left. So why don't you take a minute and a half, and then you take a minute and a half, Miles, to wrap it up.
I think talking about the Civil War is fun, and I haven't had such a good conversation in a while with until Mr. Pearlman. So anytime you want to have us on to chat about history, I'm game. So that's all I have to say.
So am I. So am I.
Go ahead, take a couple of minutes, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say one final thing, and that is that when Miles said that county from Mississippi seceded, up until 1863, Virginia was one state, okay? There was no West Virginia. but the good people of West Virginia decided to stay loyal to the Union. And as a reward, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln gave the western part of Virginia their own statehood, and that's how West Virginia became a state.
See, even I learned something just from that. I never realized that.
That's right.
And I read a lot of history books. I never saw that in the history book, by the way.
No, it's true. There's a lot of different stories in the Civil War, and I think that's about American history. There are a lot of different, not parochial, but based on where you are in the country, there's different histories. So it takes a while to learn them, but the whole point is getting interested in something and reading about it.
Right. So what do you see in the future for the South, Jeff?
For the South?
Yep.
Well, at the Daytona 500 the other day, despite the fact that they said that they do not want Confederate flags, they would actually swap a Confederate flag with an American flag, there were still dozens and dozens of Confederate flags flying there.
But
Stubbornly.
not in public space places.
No, well, at the racetrack in Daytona. And so I don't see the Confederate flag disappearing.
I don't either. I don't like it. I don't like it, but they have a right to have it.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, I certainly hope that things don't go over the top and they start messing with other things that are linked to the Confederacy, because that is our history in general.
Okay, I want to say, gentlemen, it was an honor and a pleasure to have you both come up here. Jeff, thank you for
sir.
the history lesson.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, but thank you for the history lessons, and God bless you. Jeff, you too, Miles.
Happy birthday, Morris.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Mr.
by the way,
Pearlman.
Miles,
Pleasure.
I want to congratulate you for the beautiful job you do for our city and the
thanks.
mayor's office. You do.
Thanks.
I mean, you're a credit to the community and a credit to the city of Revere. So, as a veteran, you are a veteran of the community. Thank you, Miles.
Thank you.
And thank you. God bless both of you. God bless our troops, the city of Revere, and our great country, the United States of America. And thank you all out there for listening to some great history lessons from two great people, Miles Kennedy and Jeff Pearlman. Till the next time, thank you.